Azure Web App, questions and answers. Question 1. What are deployment slots in Azure Web App? Answer. Deployment slots in Azure Web App are separate instances of your application that allow you to deploy and test changes before swapping them with the production slot. This enables seamless updates and reduces downtime. Question 2. How can you configure deployment slots in Azure Web App? Answer. Deployment slots can be configured through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell. You can create and manage slots, define slot settings, and perform slot swaps or rollbacks. Question 3. What is the purpose of configuration in Azure Web App? Answer. Configuration in Azure Web App allows you to manage settings specific to your application, such as connection strings, environment variables, and app settings. It provides flexibility and easy management of your application's behavior. Question 4. How can you manage configuration in Azure Web App? Answer. Configuration in Azure Web App can be managed through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell. You can add, modify, or remove configuration settings based on your application's requirements. Question 5. What authentication options are available in Azure Web App? Answer. Azure Web App supports various authentication options, including Azure Active Directory, social identity providers, such as Facebook and Google, and custom authentication. These options enable secure access control for your application. Question 6. How can you enable authentication in Azure Web App? Answer. Authentication can be enabled in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell. You can configure authentication providers, set up single sign-on, and customize authentication settings. Question 7. What is Application Insights in Azure Web App? Answer. Application Insights is a feature in Azure Web App that provides performance monitoring, error tracking, and usage analytics for your application. It helps you gain insights into your application's behavior and troubleshoot issues. Question 8. How can you enable Application Insights in Azure Web App? Answer. Application Insights can be enabled through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by adding the Application Insights extension to your web app. Once enabled, you can access detailed telemetry data and metrics. Question 9. What is the purpose of identity in Azure Web App? Answer. Identity in Azure Web App allows you to manage authentication and authorization for your application using Azure Active Directory. It helps secure access to your application and its resources. Question 10. How can you configure identity in Azure Web App? Answer. Identity can be configured in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by enabling Azure Active Directory authentication. You can set up user roles, permissions, and access control policies. Question 11. What are backups in Azure Web App? Answer. Backups in Azure Web App allow you to create and manage backups of your application's content and configuration. This ensures data protection and enables easy recovery in case of any issues. Question 12. How can you configure backups in Azure Web App? Answer. Backups can be configured in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by enabling backup settings and specifying the backup schedule. You can also define retention policies and storage options. Question 13. How can you add a custom domain to Azure Web App? Answer. A custom domain can be added to Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by configuring the DNS settings and binding the domain to the web app. This allows you to use your own domain name for your application. Question 14. What is the purpose of certificates in Azure Web App? Answer. Certificates in Azure Web App allow you to secure your application with SSL/TLS encryption. They help establish a secure connection between your application and its users. Question 15. How can you manage certificates in Azure Web App? Answer. Certificates can be managed in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by uploading or importing certificates. You can also configure certificate bindings and renewals. Question 16. What networking options are available in Azure Web App? Answer. Azure Web App supports various networking options, including virtual network integration, hybrid connections, and private endpoints. These options enable secure and controlled communication between your application and other resources. Question 17. How can you configure networking in Azure Web App? Answer. Networking can be configured in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by selecting the desired networking options and settings. You can define network access restrictions and connectivity rules. Question 18. What is scaling up in Azure Web App? Answer. Scaling up in Azure Web App refers to increasing the resources, CPU, memory, allocated to your application by changing the app service plan. This allows your application to handle increased workload and improve performance. Question 19. How can you scale up an Azure Web App? Answer. Azure Web App can be scaled up through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by selecting a higher tier app service plan. This increases the resources available to your application. Question 20. What is scaling out in Azure Web App? Answer. Scaling out in Azure Web App refers to increasing the number of instances running your application by changing the app service plan. This helps distribute the workload and improve application availability. Question 21. How can you scale out an Azure Web App? Answer. Azure Web App can be scaled out through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by increasing the instance count in the app service plan. This adds more instances to handle the workload. Question 22. What are web jobs in Azure Web App? Answer. Web jobs in Azure Web App allow you to run background tasks or schedule jobs alongside your web application. They provide a convenient way to perform tasks such as data processing, file processing, or periodic jobs. Question 23. How can you configure and manage web jobs in Azure Web App? Answer. Web jobs can be configured and managed in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by uploading and scheduling the job scripts. You can monitor job execution and manage job settings. Question 24. What is MySQL in App in Azure Web App? Answer. MySQL in App in Azure Web App is a local, lightweight MySQL database that can be used for development and testing purposes. It provides an easy-to-use database option without the need for separate infrastructure. Question 25. How can you enable MySQL in App in Azure Web App? Answer. MySQL in App can be enabled in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by adding the MySQL in App extension to your web app. This allows you to use a local MySQL database for your application. Question 26. What is Service Connector in Azure Web App? Answer. Service Connector in Azure Web App allows you to securely connect your application to other Azure services or external resources. It simplifies integration and enables seamless communication between your application and other services. Question 27. How can you configure Service Connector in Azure Web App? Answer. Service Connector can be configured in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by specifying the connection details and authentication settings. This allows your application to interact with other services. Question 28. What are properties in Azure Web App? Answer. Properties in Azure Web App are metadata attributes that provide additional information about your application, such as its version or environment. They help in organizing and managing your application's metadata. Question 29. How can you manage properties in Azure Web App? Answer. Properties can be managed in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by setting or updating the desired property values. This allows you to customize and organize your application's metadata. Question 30. What are locks in Azure Web App? Answer. Locks in Azure Web App allow you to prevent accidental deletion or modification of your application by applying a lock at the resource level. They provide an additional layer of protection for your application. Question 31. How can you apply locks to Azure Web App? Answer. Locks can be applied to Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by selecting the desired lock type and scope. This helps ensure the integrity and security of your application. Question 32. What are alerts in Azure Web App? Answer. Alerts in Azure Web App allow you to receive notifications when certain conditions or metrics thresholds are met. They help you proactively monitor your application and take necessary actions. Question 33. How can you configure alerts in Azure Web App? Answer. Alerts can be configured in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by defining the alert rules and notification settings. This enables you to receive timely notifications about your application's health. Question 34. What are metrics in Azure Web App? Answer. Metrics in Azure Web App provide performance and usage data about your application, such as CPU usage, memory usage, and request count. They help you monitor and analyze your application's behavior. Question 35. How can you view metrics in Azure Web App? Answer. Metrics can be viewed in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by accessing the metrics plate and selecting the desired metrics. This allows you to monitor and analyze your application's performance. Question 36. What are logs in Azure Web App? Answer. Logs in Azure Web App provide detailed information about the runtime behavior and events of your application. They include HTTP requests, errors, warnings, and other diagnostic information. Question 37. How can you view logs in Azure Web App? Answer. Logs can be viewed in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by accessing the logs plate and selecting the desired log type. This helps you troubleshoot issues and analyze your application's behavior. Question 38. What are advisor recommendations in Azure Web App? Answer. Advisor recommendations in Azure Web App provide actionable insights and best practices to optimize the performance, security, and cost efficiency of your application. They help you improve your application's overall quality. Question 39. How can you view advisor recommendations in Azure Web App? Answer. Advisor recommendations can be viewed in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by accessing the advisor blade and reviewing the recommendations. This helps you implement best practices and optimize your application. Question 40. What is the purpose of health check in Azure Web App? Answer. Health check in Azure Web App allows you to monitor the availability and responsiveness of your application by periodically sending requests to a specified endpoint. It helps ensure your application is functioning properly. Question 41. How can you configure health check in Azure Web App? Answer. Health check can be configured in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by specifying the health check endpoint and settings. This enables continuous monitoring of your application's health. Question 42. What are diagnostic settings in Azure Web App? Answer. Diagnostic settings in Azure Web App allow you to collect and send diagnostic data, such as logs and metrics, to other Azure services for analysis and monitoring. They help you gain insights into your application's behavior. Question 43. How can you configure diagnostic settings in Azure Web App? Answer. Diagnostic settings can be configured in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by selecting the desired diagnostic data and destination. This enables you to collect and analyze diagnostic information. Question 44. What are app service logs in Azure Web App? Answer. App service logs in Azure Web App provide detailed information about the runtime behavior and events of your application, including HTTP requests, errors, and warnings. They help you troubleshoot issues and monitor your application. Question 45. How can you enable and manage app service logs in Azure Web App? Answer. App service logs can be enabled and managed in Azure Web App through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell by configuring the log settings and storage destination. This allows you to collect and analyze log data. Question 46. What is log stream in Azure Web App? Answer. Log stream in Azure Web App allows you to view real-time streaming logs of your application's runtime behavior and events. It provides a live feed of log data for monitoring and troubleshooting purposes. Question 47. How can you access log stream in Azure Web App? Answer. Log stream can be accessed in Azure Web App through the Azure portal or Azure CLI by navigating to the log stream blade or using the Azure Web App log tail command. This provides real-time visibility into your application's logs. Question 48. What is Process Explorer in Azure Web App? Answer. Process Explorer in Azure Web App allows you to monitor and analyze the processes running in your application's environment. It provides insights into resource utilization and helps identify performance bottlenecks. Question 49. How can you access Process Explorer in Azure Web App? Answer. Process Explorer can be accessed in Azure Web App through the Azure portal or Azure CLI by navigating to the Process Explorer blade or using the Azure Web App process list command. This helps you analyze and optimize your application's processes. Question 50. How can Azure Web App help in achieving high availability and scalability for your application? Answer. Azure Web App provides features such as deployment slots, scaling options, and load balancing that help in achieving high availability and scalability for your application. These features ensure continuous availability, efficient resource utilization, and seamless updates. Thanks for watching.